Chapter 11. RESPECT. Katie ran up the footpath and burst into the kitchen. Her face was lit up like a birthday cake. That twinkle that was in her eye all night on their date was back and glowing brighter than ever. She pushed her way over to Nick, darting around the chairs. He turned to look down at her, and she put her hands on his sides. He loved the look in her eye that she kept locked on him. It was a look of admiration and pride, one he likewise had not seen in a long time. She took in a deep breath and let out a huge sigh of promise. "What?" he asked. "Why are you smiling, so big like that? What did my grandfather say?" She reached up and put her hands on his shadow beard. She pulled his face down to hers and kissed both sides of his cheeks, then planted a short loving kiss on the lips. Gran looked on, thrilled. Nick put his arm around Katie, pulling her into a hug, then pulled his face away. "Now, what was that for, princess?" "Oh, Nicholas Paul, I'm so proud of you. Why didn't you tell me that you reconciled with your birth father?" He nodded, threw his head back and chuckled. He loved hearing how proud she was of him. "I don't know, I guess it never came up." "It never came up, because this has been all about me, but it's not. I want to hear all about it." "Go on, Nicky, take your friend, and tell her all about it." "Do you mind, don't you need help here?" he asked. Gran shook her head. "I'm fine, it's almost done. Jeannie will be here in no time, and she'll finish it up with me." "Thank you, Gran," Katie said, leaving her with a wink and a smile. Nick led Katie out the back door, by the small of her back, giving her a huge shiver. She put her hand in his, locking their fingers together as he walked her over to the backyard canvas swing. He held it still for her to sit, and he sat down next to her, not touching their thighs together, but close enough to put his arm on the back of the swing. She turned her body toward him, putting one knee folded up on the swing as she continued to look up at him in admiration. He relished in it. "Well, it was the day that my mom found out that you were he hesitated. My teach." "Oh, boy, I bet that didn't go over well, huh?" No, she was quite shocked and very hurt that everyone knew but her. She wanted to know if I had deep-seated anger, and I realized I did to a degree. It was just like the anger you brought out of me that night on the sidewalk. I never realized how shrouded it was in there for my mother, but it was there. She explained that she stayed with James all those years because she never gave up hope that he'd change, until he ended up in prison. She loved him that much. He had written to both Annie and I a few years back, and Annie forgave him, but I refused to read the letter. Annie left it in the side table next to the bed in my old bedroom. My mom left that room for me as is, and well, I used it too many nights to pass out in on my stupid drunken days. I read his letter that night and I broke down, realizing, like you said, that I was keeping him in a prison far worse than those bars that lock him in a cell. I even wrote a song that night about him. I'll likely put it on my next album. "Oh, Nicholas Paul, I'm so proud of you, look, see the goosebumps," she said as she stuck out her arm and rubbed the goosebumps that warmed her and his heart. He rubbed her arm and loved her all the more. "Sweetness, that means more to me than you can ever know. You know, that night, my mom gave me a letter that he wrote specifically to her. I was going to read it, hoping it would encourage me on how to apologize to you. I never opened it, nor did she. I returned it to him." "Why didn't she open it?" "She said it would bring back too many of those old feelings of love that she had for her jolt giver, and she had moved on with Andy. She did not want to hurt Andy. I decided it was too personal for me to read, and I knew borrowing someone else's words wouldn't make mine any more authentic or from my heart. My dad's letter to Annie and me was the most poignant letter I have ever read. I'll show it to you someday, you'd be so proud of my dad. Seems he found God in prison when a young man went there to start a prison ministry, and that young man took to my father, right away. That man spent countless hours ministering to my dad." Katie smiled when she heard him refer to his birth father as his dad in such a loving tone. "What's that smiling about? You calling your birth father dad and speaking with such love and forgiveness in your heart." It's what I prayed for so many months back. I know, he showed me the book you sent. Katie tilted her head, having almost forgotten about this insignificant act in her eyes. Oh, yeah, well, I kept thinking about him when I wrote those chapters on how big was God's grace. You mean Katie's wrath, God's grace? She nodded. You had such a huge hand in that, you and Tony. It was such a life-changing moment for me. I know. I just didn't want to make that big of a deal about it then, but I think it was the highlight of my night. You were so concerned about Matthew and I thumping the Bible over your head, but I was determined to leave you a different person. Nick paused. What's the matter? I was so concerned about leaving you different, and so determined to become a strong man of God for you, and look how far the opposite way I went. PC, now, we've already thrown our stones in the pond. What's important is who you are right now. So, now, tell me more about your reunion with your dad. I'm so loving hearing this from you. Just like you said, you told me that I needed to find forgiveness for my dad, because someday I may need to find that kind of forgiveness from someone, in my case, everyone, but mostly from you. She smiled. 2 years prior, things she said to him still stuck. It's amazing what small insignificant things we say come back to bite us in the butt later, huh, Teach? She nodded. Go on, now tell me more. She leaned in against his bicep, wrapping her arm around his arm. Well, we had a great reunion. He's a completely different man. He's near as wise as my Gramps, if not wiser. My Gramps has even taken him under his wing, like his father-in-law did for my Gramps. My dad said in the letter that he had resigned himself to the misery of self-loathing. Then, for the first time in all his life, bowing his knee to God in repentance, he said a peace washed over him. He said for the first time, he understood how big, huge and wide was God's grace. I think God must have put that understanding in his heart. Yet with all the peace that God had bestowed upon him, he was still in a prison from my unforgiveness. He would never fully be free until I set him free. I was the last to come around. So, before I left for Indianapolis, to begin my apologies, I went to see my dad. Katie crooked her head. Why did you go to Indianapolis? To go see Tony, to apologize to her for the man I became. Katie gasped. She put one hand to her mouth and the other to her heart as tears welled in her eyelids. Our Tony? The waitress? Nick nodded. Katie took in a huge breath and shiver. She sent me a copy of your book in the mail. It was the copy you signed for her, and she put a note in it, sharing her heart and her grief for the man I had become, not able to understand how I could have hurt you so. Katie started to pull in shallow breaths. She told me to bring the book back, but with you on my arm. I couldn't have hoped for that much, so I just brought it back to her, alone. It was there that she told me that she saw you a few months before. Katie's bottom lip quivered, and her eyes stung with tears of joy, the kind of tears that had been long since missing from her eyes. That was one of the lowest moments of her life, returning there during her and Nick's rivalry. Yeah, we all went there, after a church event, at that same church that Matthew sent me to for that ladies' conference. I gotta tell you, it was the hardest thing being there. It was all I could do to contain my emotions, so as to not hurt Scotty. Of course, the girls told him that was where we spent that night in our love booth, they called it. I wanted to kill them for that. Scotty's eyes became so dark. I thought it was a mistake going there. Seeing Tony nearly broke my heart when I thought about the last time I was there, with you, and where we were then. The pain in my heart that night was actually palpable. I get that, because it was for me also when I walked in there and saw our booth, knowing you hated me so. I never hated you, darling, just what happened to you. I'm sorry that it was such a difficult time for you, Teach. She told me that you didn't look so good, and she was worried. That was when she took the book and sent it to me. She had already read the Kindle version several times. I guess she was trying to snap me out of my mess, but I didn't see the book until after I arrived home that third week in February. Katie looked at him with such a renewed respect in her eyes for her Nicholas Paul. That is the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. I can't believe you went to the Circle City to see Tony and apologize to even her. I'm so impressed with you, Nicholas Paul, I am so very impressed. Katie got up on her knees, threw her arms around his neck like she did so many times before in that restaurant booth. He put his arm around her waist. You, my PC, are a grandfather's treasure and the finest model in clay, just like I suspected. She kissed him on the cheek and laid her head down on his shoulder. He put his other arm slightly around her so as not to be too forward. Teach, do you know how that makes me feel to hear you say that? She held his cheek with one hand, pushing the other side of his face into her lips. Do you know how much it warms my heart to see my Nicholas Paul back, but not just back, but better than ever? She slid down his side, and held on to his arm, hugging his bicep. I really like being friends with this Nicholas Paul. He squeezed his eyes closed, letting his heart open up more to her. He realized that not only did she lock up her heart, but to some degree, he had reserved and closed off a space in his heart from the fear of him not ever winning her back. The fresh meadow smells, reminding him of the early spring, was remnant of the awakening spring of their love. Just 2 months ago, it was the dead of winter, likewise in Katie's heart for him, but now the rebirth of her love for him was giving them both new life for hope and happiness. 2 months ago, he was drunk and despaired, and she was demoralized and dying. Now, both of them felt the rush of the love cocktail bring life back into their hearts. It was getting more difficult to fight off the love she felt for him with each passing moment that day. She was becoming less afraid of loving Nick, and more afraid of losing Scotty. The two renewing lovers sat quietly, watching the sun set in the back field and enjoying the red sky, swaying with the breezes that blew the tall grasses. Katie moaned at the beauty of it. Nick moaned at having his teach so close to him as soon as he did. 6 weeks ago, he could never have even hoped for such a warm affection between them. A few moments after the sun hid behind the horizon, a little boy's voice came running toward them from the back door. Katie looked, and there was a young boy, who had Nick's eyes and resembled him very much, but yet had a different look about his face. He came running toward Nick, exuberant to see his big brother. Nick! Nick! He yelled as he ran toward him. Nick stood, and the little boy jumped up into his arms. Hello, there little man, how you doing? Katie stood and looked up at the miniature Nicholas Paul and chuckled at the dimples. She put her fingers up to his dimples and pinched his cheeks. Gee, I wonder where he got these, must be a family trait, huh? Little guy, those dimples are going to knock some poor innocent lady on her behind, one day, and she'll be a prisoner to them. He looked down at Katie and patted her on her head. You must be the teacher. I am she. So tell me, what grade are you in? I'm in 2nd grade, he answered with pride. Well then, you are too smart for me, I'm only a kindergarten teacher, I have no idea what goes on in 2nd grade. You'll have to fill me in, you think you can do that? Sure, we have math, that's where we add numbers and take away. I even do some multiplying. He said looking down at Katie. Multiplying, are you serious? My goodness, you must be really smart. PC, you have to hang with your brother more often, he might be able to teach you something. Ha, ha, very funny, teach. Nick, what do I call her? Miss Kate is what my students called me. Do you think we could settle on that? Is that okay, Nick? Sounds good to me. Miss Kate? What, sweet pea? Are you going to marry my brother? Katie chuckled an uncomfortable laugh. Just as Nick tried to correct Robbie, a heavy-set woman, who looked like she was in her mid to late 50s, came from the back door. She had a smile on her face from ear to ear, and running out from behind her came Annie. Excuse me, Mom, she brushed past her mother and ran up to Katie for a giant bear hug. Mrs. Moore, how great it is to see you, again. My Ray is working, but he's supposed to come, later. Annie, now I told you, I'm Katie, and I'm thrilled to see you, also, she said as she hugged Annie, yet-eyed the mother. Katie had an uncomfortable smile on her face with her nervousness in her stare. She held on to Nick's upper arm, while Robbie remained held up by Nick. Behind the woman was a 6-foot-tall man who looked to be about in his 50s with a minimal belly hanging over his belt, certainly not as protruding as one of a typical late middle-aged man. He had very short thin hair, partially white with dark, dirty blonde mixed in, and all gray sideburns. His almond-shaped eyes melded in with his wide oval-shaped face, which was clean-shaven. He had on khaki pants and a Hawaiian shirt with bold white and light green flowers on a dark green background. The woman's hair was cut in a short bob and was frosted with light platinum and light brown streaks. Her loose-fitting, rounded neck blouse only accentuated her heavy-set body, and her brown slacks ended in dark brown loafers, looking as if they're worn to accommodate painfully warped feet. She walked with somewhat of a limp as if she was in pain but did the best she could to ignore and mask it. "Not feeling well, today, huh, Mom?" "Oh, I'll be fine, Nick," she said as she hugged her son, who still held his brother. "Hi, I'm Jeannie, it's so nice to meet you." She put her hand out for a handshake. "Really?" Katie said, winking at Nick. "Teach, don't you be starting." Nick looked down at her with stern authority. "No, really. I'm so glad to meet you, Mrs. Moore." Katie put her hand in Jeannie's. Jeannie wanted Katie to know just how much she welcomed her, as opposed to the resentment she once had put out in the public in a statement, defending her son. "I'm Katie, and I'm very glad to meet you. Sorry if I seemed like I was giving you a hard time, I tend to have a bit of a strange sense of humor." "I'm Andy, and I am glad to meet you," he said with facetiousness and sarcasm, elbowing his wife. "I read your book, Katie, and it's a delightful book. You've triumphed over much. I particularly liked that chapter entitled Job's Princess. I think that was my favorite." Jeannie said. "I think maybe we are more kindred spirits than you'd think, Mrs. Oh, dear, I don't know your last name." "It's Williamson, but I'm Jeannie," she said to Katie and looked up at Nick. "Why didn't I know that?" Nick shrugged his shoulder. "Mr. Thomas, there's just so much about your background I need to know more about, seeing how you've had my life story a couple of different ways. Didn't you tell me that you bought property down here? I can't wait until you move here, is it soon?" Annie asked. Katie shot a look at Annie. "Oops, I wasn't supposed to mention that, was I?" Katie shook her head and looked up at Nick, who feigned a surprised, delighted face. "Well, the cat's out of the bag, I guess. Soon, I'm going to be donning a Tennessee driver's license. But don't you ever expect me to put on any orange, pal, because I look simply dreadful in orange." Nick smiled jubilantly. "Actually, I'm a Sooners fan, and theirs is a dark red, like a cranberry color." "Oh, I love that color. I think I could get away with that in Kentucky blue country, but if I ever showed up wearing orange, I fear I'd be shot." They all laughed. "Sooners? Who are they anyway?" Katie asked. "Oklahoma Sooners, my alma mater," Andy said. "When I moved in with this lovely family, so did the Sooners. It was part of the marriage pact." Katie guffawed and Jeannie shook her head. "Hey, how about some help in here?" Gran called from the porch. "Oh, Mom, I'm sorry." "Come on, Annie, let's get helping your Gran. Andy, how about you and Nick set the table, and little Robbie, you want to go get Gramps?" Jeannie asked. "Robbie, Gramps has a new horse in there, she spooks easily, so you must go in the barn slow and quiet," Nick told his little brother. "I got it." Nick put Robbie down and he ran for the footpath. "Slowly," I said, Nick yelled to his brother. Robbie slowed down and waved with his hand going up over his shoulder. "I'll help check the salad. Your son made that, and I'm not sure if it's safe or edible." "Wait, Nicky, you made the salad? Do you even know what a salad is?" Annie asked, shoving Nick. Katie guffawed. "Yes, well, your brother has had a few lessons today in how to get around in a kitchen. He's a quick learner, but not very sanitary. Nick shook his head. I washed the salad bowl, and I spun the lettuce in that spinning thing that Gran gave me. Katie put her arm around Jeannie's shoulder as they walked toward the house. Jeannie, I have to talk to you about Nick's laundry, she said as she looked back at Nick and winked. Annie started laughing. Jeannie turned to face Katie, then looked back at Nick. Really, Jeannie, this boy needs to grow up and wash his own skivvies. Annie continued to laugh and Nick chuckled. Ha ha, teach. I'll show him how to operate the washing machine, then I'll quiz him. I'll even let him get extra credit for doing my laundry, too. She looked back again, and Nick cracked up, shaking his head. When supper was over, and they were all sitting around the table just gabbing, getting to know each other, Katie thought that she heard a Chris Tomlin song. Shoo! You hear that? The room became silent, and a muffled ringtone could be heard. That's my phone, excuse me. She jumped up from the table and headed for the living room. When she reached the sofa, she could hear the ringtone, but could not find the phone. Nick followed to help her locate the source of the ringtone. She searched frantically. I can't find my phone. That's Scotty's ringtone, help me, Nick, please. Nick dug around the couch and then put his hands between the cushions, pulling out her phone, which had stopped ringing. I got it, but you missed it. Nick pushed the redial button. Here, now get yourself some peace of mind. You can go out on the three-season porch and talk. Katie took her phone and headed for the rear of the home. Annie stood in the doorway, watching in shock as her brother redialed his competitor's phone number. When he walked toward Annie, she questioned him. What the heck was that? Why on earth would you encourage that? Nick looked at his sister and led her away from the living room. He looked at his mother, who nodded with understanding, as one who knew the secret. No one at the table seemed shocked, except Annie. What's going on here? Why would you want her to talk to the trooper, and help her find the phone? Why are you not bothered by her frantic search? You all seem so nonchalant about this thing. Nick, what's going on? Come on, Annie. Nick led his sister out the front door and walked down the long driveway toward his Escalade. Several moments later, Jeannie went to the window to check on them. She saw Annie's head drop and her body shake and tremble as she wept. Nick pulled his sister in his arms, then pulled away, putting his hand on her shoulder as if instructing her to pull it together. Oh, Nick, that's simply awful. Aren't they really attached or something? Yes, very much. She is crazy about him, but not in love with him. She has this deep abiding love for him, and they've been together for a long time. How is she going to deal with that? It's going to be brutal. That's why Scotty is leaving her in the next couple of weeks to go to his sister's. He's trying to help her make the break, and he's put her grieving under my charge. Wow, what a guy. Annie wiped her face with her palms. She then looked in the side mirrors of the Escalade to try to see if the tears were evident. Annie, that man is incredible. I have an awesome responsibility, helping Katie cope with this, the breakup and then the mourning. I've decided to take things very slow with her. We are friends, and that is it. She is so clingy with him right now. He's been distancing himself from her, and she's picking up on it. To her, gaining me is losing him. She's convinced she can't live without him. I've watched them together. Scotty is very broken up about this. They are very codependent upon each other. No kidding, he's dying for Pete's sake. No, he's broken up about how hard this will be for Katie. That poor woman has been through hell, and now she's losing another loved one. Oh, Nick, it's so not fair. Annie began to cry, and Nick took his sister in his arms to comfort her. It's going to be rough on the entire Moore family. The girls don't know either. Scotty is a very important member, and very much loved by them. I can see why. He's a hero in my eyes. As they were speaking, Sean and Kathy pulled up. Nick looked up past Annie and she spun around, both noting his brand new Toyota Sequoia. Sean exited the vehicle and went over to Kathy's door. He then opened the back side door, and 2 boys and an older girl exited the vehicle. They all ran up to Nick and Annie and hugged them. Kathy hugged Nick, then proceeded to give Annie a long compassionate hug as Annie informed Kathy that she was in the know. "Nice, Sean. I obviously pay you too much." Sean knocked on the hood of Nick's Escalade. I don't think so, or you'd be driving this, and I'd be driving that," he said as he patted Nick's back. "So, you brought the whole family, not trying to freak her out, huh?" "What? She loves kids, they'll get along great." "I figure if anything, they'll break the ice," Sean said. "So, how you doin', bro?" He put his hand out to shake Nick's. "Fine. I just told Annie about Scotty." "Please tell me that you didn't tell your children." "Gee, well, they may have read it in the press release I put out." Nick looked down at Sean. "What do you take me for, a tortoise brain like you?" "They have no connection here, of course I did not mention it. Only Kath knows. I think this is one time she can keep a secret." "So, how'd it go with Katie when you got here?" "I did what you said. She of course tried to apologize first, but I took responsibility. Things are good, and I'm staying away from her to control my reaction to her." "You'd be proud of me, Sean." Sean nodded and patted Nick on his back. As Sean and Nick headed toward the door, Annie and Kathy stayed behind. "I'm going to sit out here for a few more moments and talk to Kathy, okay?" "That's a good idea," Nick said as Annie continued to wipe away the tears. "What's with her?" Francine Everett, Sean's 18-year-old daughter, named after his grandfather, asked her father. "She's fine, just weepy from the pregnancy," Sean replied. "She's pregnant?" Frankie asked. "Oops," Sean said. "So, sleeping with Kathy all this time has given you loose lips, huh?" "Frankie, I think Annie was waiting to announce it, maybe even tonight." "Please don't spoil the surprise," Nick said, putting his arm around the pretty brunette, whose hair was pulled back. He flicked her ponytail sticking out through the hole in the back of her baseball cap. "Softball practice?" She nodded. "Sorry we are so late, we actually had a game, it was our first and we won." "Well, that's great." Chapter 12. God's Genius and Equal Opportunity Genius.